She walked away after his public rejection. 1 week later, the Alpha King's kingdom began to crumble without her. The night it all broke open, Serena was sitting at a dinner table surrounded by people who were laughing at her. Not loudly. Not cruelly, not all of them, not in a way that anyone would admit to later. It was the kind of laughter that travels around a table like a slow wave, polite and uncomfortable, the kind that people produce when they are not sure whether something is funny or terrible, and they choose the safer option. Serena sat very still. Her hands were in her lap. Her face gave nothing away. And inside, something that had been bending for years finally went straight. Her name was Serena Lawson. She was 34 years old. She had kind eyes and a sharp mind and the sort of patience that people often confused with weakness, because she never raised her voice and she never made scenes, and she had a way of solving problems before other people had even noticed the problems existed. She had grown up in a small town in the north of England, the daughter of a librarian mother and a carpenter father, and she had inherited from both of them something steady and real, something that held its shape even under pressure. She had moved to London at 22, built a career in communications, made a good life for herself, and then, at 28, she had met Oliver Grant. Oliver Grant was the kind of man who filled a room. That was the phrase people used about him, and it was accurate. He was tall and confident and loud in a way that got described as charismatic rather than exhausting, at least by people who did not live with him. He had strong opinions about everything, a wide circle of friends, and a job in property development that he talked about constantly and successfully, so that over time his confidence began to look like competence, and people stopped questioning the difference. He was handsome in a conventional way. He laughed easily. He made excellent first impressions. Serena had been drawn to his certainty at first. She had spent her 20s being careful and considered, and there was something almost restful about a person who seemed to have no doubts at all. He pursued her with real energy, and she let herself be pursued, and after 6 months they moved in together, and after 2 years he proposed, and she said yes because she loved him and because she believed that love meant choosing to stay even when things were difficult, and because she had not yet understood the difference between a relationship that required work and a relationship that was quietly consuming her. By the time they had been together for 4 years, the shape of their life together was clear, even if Serena had not yet named it. She was the one who remembered things. She remembered his mother's birthday and his colleague's wife's name and the anniversary of the dinner where they had first kissed and the fact that his dry cleaning needed to be collected before Friday. She remembered all of it, every thread of every relationship in their shared life, and she held it, gently and consistently, the way you hold something fragile, because if she let it go, it would not be held at all. She was the one who made their home feel like a home. She cooked 4 nights a week and organized the 5th into a restaurant booking, always somewhere Oliver would like, always with a reservation made well in advance because she had learned that last-minute things made him tense. She handled the household accounts. She dealt with the landlord when the boiler broke. She bought the birthday gifts for his friends and wrote the cards in handwriting that was not her own because Oliver had once mentioned that his handwriting was poor, and she had simply taken the task on without either of them commenting on it. She was the one who managed the social life that Oliver prided himself on. Their dinner parties were Oliver's dinner parties, as far as anyone who attended them was concerned, because Oliver was the one who stood at the head of the table and told stories and commanded attention. But it was Serena who had chosen the guest list with quiet care, thinking about who would get along with whom, who was going through a difficult time and might need a warm evening out, who had not seen each other in too long. It was Serena who had planned the menu with full knowledge of every allergy and preference at the table. It was Serena who had spent the afternoon cooking, who had set the table, who had chosen the music, who had made the whole evening feel effortless, which is to say she had done the work of making the effort invisible. And Oliver received the compliments. He did so naturally, without guilt, because he had never been asked to look at what was happening behind the impression he made. He was not a cruel man, not deliberately. He was something more ordinary and in some ways more difficult to name. He was a man who had been allowed, for a very long time, to take without noticing that he was taking. The subtle signs had been there for longer than Serena allowed herself to admit. The way he would begin to speak over her sentence before she had finished it, not aggressively, just as though her words were a stepping stone to his own thoughts rather than something worth waiting to hear. The way he would summarize her ideas at work dinners, repeating what she had just said in slightly different words, and the other people at the table would nod as though the idea had only fully arrived when he had said it. The way he would look at his phone when she was talking about something that mattered to her, glancing up at intervals to produce a sound that was almost a response. She had noticed these things. She had mentioned some of them, carefully, in the way that people mention things when they are not sure they have the right to complain. Oliver would always receive her concerns with a kind of puzzled patience, as though she were raising something unnecessarily complicated, and he would say something like, "You're so sensitive," or "I didn't mean it like that," and the conversation would end without resolution, and Serena would feel, somehow, that she had made things worse by raising them. She kept going. That was the honest truth of it. She kept going because she loved him, or because she had loved him once so completely that the love had become structural, something she had built her life around and could not easily dismantle. She kept going because leaving felt like failure, and she had never been comfortable with failure. She kept going because their friends were mostly Oliver's friends first, and she was afraid of what she would lose if she left. She kept going because she was not sure, for a long time, whether what was happening to her was real or whether it was something she was doing to herself. Her closest friend, a woman named Claire Whitmore, had tried to say something about it once, about a year before the dinner party, over coffee on a Saturday morning when Oliver was playing golf. Claire had a directness that came from real care, and she had said, gently but plainly, that she sometimes felt worried about Serena, that she sometimes felt like Serena had disappeared a little, become smaller than the person she used to be. Serena had listened, and smiled, and said that things were fine, and changed the subject, and the moment had passed. She was not ready then. She would be ready later. What she did not know, sitting across from Claire that morning, was that she was somewhere in the last months of a version of herself that had given too much to the wrong person, and that the dinner party that was still 12 months away would be the last night she would ever spend as Oliver Grant's silent foundation. She did not know that yet. But something in her was beginning to know it, the way a body sometimes knows things before the mind catches up, the way you wake up one morning and understand, without explanation, that something has finally reached its end. Oliver once told a friend, laughing, that Serena kept the machine running. He said it fondly. He thought it was a compliment. He never once considered who had built the machine, or what would happen when she decided to walk away from it. She was about to show him. She had never been to that particular restaurant before. It was one of Oliver's choices, one of the places he had been wanting to try for months because a colleague had described it as the kind of place worth being seen at, and Oliver responded to that kind of description the way other people respond to a good book review. He wanted to go. He made a reservation. He told Serena a few days before, and she had rearranged 2 things in her schedule without mentioning it, because that was how their life worked. There were 8 of them at the table that night. Oliver's friend Nathan Booth, who worked in finance and had a loud laugh and strong opinions about things he knew little about. Nathan's wife, Diane, who was quiet and watchful and whom Serena had always quietly liked. Oliver's colleague Paul Reese, who had recently been promoted and had spent most of the evening talking about it. Paul's girlfriend, a woman named Tara who had the carefully assembled look of someone who wanted very much to be approved of. And then a couple Serena had not met before, friends of Nathan's named Owen and Gillian Marsh, who were pleasant and polite and had the comfortable ease of people who had been together for a long time. The evening had started well enough. The food was good. The wine was flowing. Oliver was in his element, which meant he was telling a story at the center of the table's attention, and the other men were laughing at the right moments, and the women were nodding, and everything had the smooth, performed quality of a dinner party going exactly as planned. Serena was listening. She was also doing what she often did at these dinners, which was the quiet work of making sure the conversation flowed and no one felt left out, directing a question toward Owen when he went quiet, drawing Jillian in when she seemed to be losing the thread of things, keeping an eye on whether anyone needed their glass refilled, noticing whether the table needed anything, being, as she was always being, the person who made the whole room run without anyone realizing a room needed running. It was during the main course that the conversation turned to careers. Paul had been talking about his promotion for the 4th time that evening, and Nathan had been countering with stories about deals he had closed, and it was the particular kind of table talk that men like Oliver often fell into, competitive and enthusiastic, the measuring of one another done in the language of professional success. Tara asked Serena what she did. It was a simple question. Serena answered it simply. She explained that she worked in communications, that she ran campaigns for a small firm, that she had recently taken on a new client in the healthcare space and was finding the work interesting. She mentioned, briefly, that she had been considering starting something of her own, a consultancy, that she had been thinking about it for a while and was beginning to put together a real plan. She had been thinking about it for more than a while, actually. The plan existed in a notebook in her bedside drawer, detailed and careful and months in the making, full of research and contacts and projected timelines. She had not talked about it much because it felt fragile still, the way new plans feel fragile before they have been spoken out loud enough times to become real. She had told Oliver about it. He had said, "That's ambitious," in a tone that made ambition sound like something to be cautious of. She mentioned it at the table that night, not the notebook, not the full scale of what she had been building quietly, just the idea. That she was thinking about going out on her own. Oliver laughed. It was not a mean laugh. That would have been easier to understand, and easier to confront. It was a fond laugh, the laugh of someone who found something endearing and slightly misguided, the way you might laugh at a child who announces they are going to climb Everest. He shook his head a little. He said, "Serena's always had big ideas." He said it to the table, not to her. He said it the way people say things when they are inviting others to share a perspective that he had already formed. "It's sweet," he said. "But you know how it is." He then moved the conversation forward, back to Paul and the promotion, and the table followed, because the table always followed Oliver, and the moment closed over itself the way water closes over a stone, smooth and immediate and without evidence that anything had fallen. Except that Diane had seen it. Serena noticed that. Diane, who was quiet and watchful, had looked at Serena across the table with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite anger, something more precise than either of those things, the look of a woman who recognizes something she has seen before and is sorry to be seeing it again. Nathan laughed along with Oliver. Paul laughed because Nathan laughed. Tara looked uncertain. Jillian looked at Owen. Owen reached for his wine. Serena sat with her hands in her lap. Her face was calm. She took one breath, and then another, and she looked at the tablecloth for just a moment, and in that moment something finished. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Not in a way that anyone at the table would have been able to identify or describe later. It was the quietest thing that had ever happened to her, and it was absolute. She did not speak for the rest of the meal. She answered when addressed. She smiled at the right moments. She passed the bread when it needed passing. She did the things that she had always done, the small labors of keeping an evening alive, and she did them on a kind of quiet automatic, because the part of her that had always done them was still doing them, even as another part of her had already left the table and was already somewhere far from this restaurant, already beginning something new. In the car on the way home, Oliver talked about the evening. He said it had been a good night. He said Paul was a bit much but that Nathan was on good form. He asked if Serena had liked Jillian. She said Jillian seemed lovely. He said the sea base had been excellent. She agreed that it had been good. He did not mention what he had said. It is possible it had not even registered as anything worth remembering. She looked out the window at the city passing by. The lights streaked through the glass. She thought about the notebook in her bedside drawer. She thought about the 4 years she had spent being someone's soft background, someone's invisible infrastructure, someone's kept machine. She thought about the look on Diane's face. She thought about Claire saying she had disappeared a little. She had not cried in the restaurant. She did not cry in the car. She sat in the passenger seat and looked at the city, and she thought, very clearly, with a steadiness that surprised even her, enough. She was not angry. Anger would have been understandable, would have been easy even, but what she felt was something cleaner than anger, something more final. She felt the particular calm that comes when a decision has already been made and all that remains is the carrying out of it. Over the following 4 days, Serena moved with a quiet precision that would have impressed anyone watching, if anyone had been paying close enough attention to watch. She called Claire the morning after the dinner and told her everything. Not just the dinner, all of it, the years of it, the slow accumulation of small erasures. Claire listened without interrupting. At the end she said, "I've been waiting for you to get here." She did not say it unkindly. She said it like relief. Serena spoke to a solicitor on the 2nd day, a friend of a colleague, just to understand her situation and her options. She did not make any dramatic decisions. She gathered information. She had always been good at gathering information. On the 3rd day, while Oliver was at work, she began moving her things. Not all at once, not in armfuls, methodically, one careful category at a time. Claire came and helped. They did not rush. They were so quiet and so organized that by the end of the 3rd day, the important things were already gone, the things that were hers by nature and not just by proximity, and what remained in the flat was still neat and whole-looking, the way something can look complete even after the most essential parts of it have already been removed. On the 5th day, she sent Oliver a message. It was not long. It said that she had left, that she wished him well, that she did not think there was anything useful to be gained from a long conversation, and that she hoped he would, in time, understand what he had lost. It did not say more than that, because there was no more that needed saying, and because she had learned, finally, that she did not owe him the labor of explaining herself to him. He called 3 times that evening. She let the calls go. She was sitting in the spare room at Claire's house, eating toast and reading the notebook she had taken from her bedside drawer, the one full of plans, the one that still had months of careful thought written into its pages. She read through it and she made notes in the margins and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, like herself. Oliver Grant had laughed at her in front of 8 people. He had wrapped the dismissal in warmth and presented it as affection, and for a moment the table had received it that way. But Serena had felt it land exactly as it was, a small, certain message about how he saw her, about how he had always seen her, and she had decided, in the stillness that followed, that she would not be seen that way again. She did not know yet what would happen to him when she was gone. She did not know that his world was already beginning to wobble on its axis, that the invisible threads she had held for years were already going slack and pulling loose, that the kingdom he had built on the quiet labor of a woman he had underestimated was already, slowly, starting to come apart. She would not find out immediately. She was too busy building something new to look back. But the people around Oliver Grant were already beginning to notice. They were already beginning to understand something that he had not yet begun to suspect, that the woman who had just walked out of his life had been holding a great deal more of it together than he had ever once thought to notice. The first sign appeared on a Tuesday. Oliver had arranged a dinner. Not a large one, just 4 people, Nathan and Diane, and a man named Greg Holt who worked in property law and whom Oliver had been trying to impress for several months, and Greg's wife, a warm, self-contained woman named Lena. It was the kind of dinner that was also, quietly, a professional opportunity, the kind that required the right atmosphere and the right food and the right combination of warmth and intelligence in the room. Oliver had arranged these dinners before, regularly, and they had always gone well, and he had always accepted the compliments afterward with genuine pleasure, never once examining what had actually made them work. He had told Serena about the dinner approximately 1 week before she left. In the version of reality that no longer existed, she would have taken the details and done what she always did. But Serena was gone now, and Oliver had not yet understood what that meant in practical terms, because he had never had to understand it before. He ordered food in. He chose a good restaurant that did delivery, expensive and reliable, and he arranged it in serving dishes so that it would look like less of an assembly job and more of an occasion. He bought wine that he knew was good. He tidied the flat himself, which took him considerably longer than it should have, because he was not entirely sure where things were kept, because Serena had always known where things were kept. The dinner table had 4 chairs, correctly. The candles, which he lit because he vaguely remembered that Serena always lit candles for dinner parties, were from a set he found in a drawer, but he could not find the holders and used a different container that did not quite work, and the whole arrangement looked slightly off, slightly effortful in a way that drew attention to itself. Diane noticed immediately. Serena would have known she would. The conversation was fine. Oliver was still Oliver, still able to fill a room with his presence and his confidence, still able to tell a story and land a joke and keep the energy moving. But something was different, and the people at the table felt it without being able to name it. The way you feel a room has changed even before you have worked out what has moved. The food was good, but the serving of it was awkward. The transition between conversation and eating was clumsy. The evening had a slightly unfinished quality, like a piece of music with a note missing somewhere in the middle. Greg Holt was polite and professional throughout. He did not say anything unkind. But at the end of the evening, when Oliver followed up the next morning with a message asking whether they might meet to discuss a potential collaboration, Greg replied in a tone that was warm but vague, suggesting they keep in touch, which in professional language meant nothing was happening, not now, possibly not ever. Oliver stared at the message for a long moment and did not understand why. He would not have understood it even if someone had explained it to him, which no one did, because the explanation required him to understand something about Serena that he had never allowed himself to see. The reason Greg Holt had always been worth cultivating, the reason Oliver even knew Greg's name, was that Serena had heard it mentioned at a gathering 14 months ago and had thought, quietly and without comment, that this was a person worth knowing. She had engineered a second meeting. She had remembered Greg's interest in a particular architectural project and brought it up at the right moment. She had followed up with a handwritten note after a Christmas event, because she remembered that Greg had mentioned being from a family where handwritten notes meant something, and that small detail had opened a door. Oliver had walked through the door and called it his own. Without Serena, the door was closed. He did not know it had ever been held open. The second sign came from his work, more slowly and more painfully. Oliver worked with a team of 5 people, and for 4 years the team had functioned well. There was a junior developer named Sam, an architect named Helen, a project manager named Daniel, and an office manager named Grace. Grace was the one who had always, in Oliver's mind, kept things ticking over, which was his way of describing competence that he did not fully understand and therefore did not fully value. But it was not Grace, actually, who had kept the most important things ticking over. It was Serena. Serena had befriended Grace 2 years ago, and through Grace she had quietly kept a hand in the warm functioning of Oliver's office. She remembered team birthdays, because Oliver forgot them and Grace had mentioned once that it mattered to the junior staff. She had organized the Christmas party 2 years running, because Oliver did not want to deal with it and Grace had been grateful for the help. She had sat with Daniel once, over coffee, when he was having a difficult time with a demanding client, and had talked him through it with the kind of calm directness that Daniel had described afterward to his wife as the most useful conversation he had had in months. She had not done any of this for credit. She had done it because she paid attention to people, and paying attention to people was simply how she lived. The team did not know Serena was gone at first. Then Grace heard, through the particular information channels that office managers always operate, and Grace told Helen quietly, and Helen told Sam, and within a week the whole team knew, and there was a quality of unease in the office that Oliver noticed without understanding its source. He thought it was a project issue. He called a meeting to address workflow inefficiencies. The meeting accomplished nothing. Daniel resigned 3 weeks later. He had been quietly unhappy for some time, and Serena's steadying influence had been one of the reasons he had stayed as long as he had, though he would not have been able to articulate it exactly in those terms. His departure left a gap in the project pipeline that cost Oliver real money and more real time. Oliver blamed the market. The social erosion was the hardest thing, and it happened the slowest, and so it was the last thing he was able to see. Oliver's social world had always appeared to belong to him. He was its visible center, its loudest voice, its most recognizable personality. But Serena had been its connective tissue. She was the reason the group dinners happened at the frequency they did, because she was the one who proposed them and organized them and made sure the right people were included and the right tensions were avoided. She was the reason people felt warmly toward Oliver even after evenings where Oliver had been, on balance, slightly too much of himself, because Serena's warmth insulated him, distributed goodwill, smoothed the edges. She was the reason people called him a good friend, even when he was inconsistent about calling back or remembering plans, because Serena remembered and followed up and made the friendship feel tended, even when it was not. Without her, the group dinners became less frequent. They did not stop, not immediately, but they required more effort from other people, and when they did happen, there was a quality of looseness to them, a slightly missing center. Nathan and Diane came to the first one after Serena left. They did not come to the second. Oliver texted Nathan asking if everything was all right, and Nathan replied immediately and cheerfully that everything was great, they had just been busy. And Oliver believed him because Oliver usually believed what people told him about their own availability. Diane had gone to see Serena. She had reached out the week after the dinner party, a quiet message that said simply that she was thinking of her and hoping she was all right. They had coffee. Then they had another coffee, and then a walk, and over the weeks that followed, a friendship formed between them that was genuine and uncomplicated. Something that had been impossible when Serena was Oliver's partner and Diane was Nathan's wife, and the social geometry of their little world required them to exist primarily in relation to their men rather than to each other. Diane did not tell Nathan much about her growing friendship with Serena. Nathan did not ask. But the friendship shifted something in Diane's own life, reminded her of something she had let go quiet, and that shift had its own consequences, its own slowly spreading ripples. And those ripples would reach Oliver eventually, though it would take more time. He sent Serena a second message, about 3 weeks after the first. It was longer than the first, and it had a different quality to it, less confident, more searching. It said that he had been thinking. That he was sorry if he had made her feel undervalued. That he thought they should talk. That he missed her. The word came near the end, after several sentences that were still, beneath their surface, primarily about him and his perspective and his feelings, but the word was there, and it was real. She read the message while she was sitting at her desk in the small office space she had rented for the first month of her new consultancy. The notebook had become a plan. The plan had become a business registration and a website and 3 initial client meetings and a growing list of contacts who were excited about what she was building. She had not advertised herself. She had simply told people she trusted what she was doing, and those people had told other people, because she was exactly the kind of person that other people wanted to tell others about. She read Oliver's message. She thought about the dinner table and the laughter and the sound his voice made when he said, "It's sweet." She thought about the 4 years of mornings and evenings and dinner parties and conversations and all the small, careful work she had done to keep a life running that turned out to belong, in every way that mattered, to someone else. She put her phone face down on the desk and went back to her work. She did not reply. There are things a person does not miss until they are gone, and Oliver Grant was beginning to understand this in a way that was neither comfortable nor quick. He had not expected to feel it in the kitchen. That was the first surprise. He had always thought of himself as reasonably self-sufficient, the kind of man who could look after himself, who had managed perfectly well before Serena and would manage perfectly well after. And it was true that he could cook in a basic sense, in the sense of producing food that was edible and recognizable. What he had not understood was the difference between feeding himself and the particular warmth of a well-made meal, the difference between function and atmosphere, and how much of the atmosphere of his life had been Serena's invisible work. He ate out more. This was fine financially, for a while, and socially it served a purpose, giving him a reason to be around people, to maintain the impression of a life running normally. He went to restaurants he and Serena had liked, partly because they were good and partly, though he would not have said this openly, because being in rooms where her taste had once guided him made him feel, briefly, less disordered. He was at one of these restaurants on a Thursday evening, eating alone with a book he was not really reading, when he saw Diane. She was with Serena. They were at a table across the room, close enough that he could see them clearly, far enough that they had not seen him. Or perhaps they hadn't chosen not to acknowledge it, he could not be sure. They were deep in conversation, Serena talking, Diane listening with real attention and then laughing, genuinely, a real laugh that changed her whole face, and then Serena laughing too, and the two of them looking like people who had been friends for a long time rather than people who had only recently found each other. Oliver watched for longer than he should have. He was not eavesdropping, the restaurant was too loud and they were too far away. He was simply watching, the way you watch something that confuses you, trying to understand it. What confused him was Serena herself. She looked different. He tried to identify the difference and could not, precisely, but it was there. She looked lighter. She looked present. She was gesturing as she talked, her hands moving expressively, and she was taking up space in a way that he realized, with a small and uncomfortable start, he had never quite seen her do before. He had a memory, sudden and unwanted, of the way she used to hold herself at their dinner parties. Attentive, contained, always slightly angled toward other people, always oriented outward rather than inward. He had thought of this as her manner. He understood now, watching her across the room at a table that had nothing to do with him, that it had not been her manner at all. It had been her adaptation. It was what she had become in order to exist in a space that required her to be useful before she was allowed to be herself. He did not approach them. He paid his bill and left, and he walked home in the evening air with a feeling that he could not name immediately and then, at some point during the walk, named reluctantly, grief. Not the grief of losing something that had been stolen from him, but the quieter and more uncomfortable grief of understanding what you had chosen to overlook while it was still within reach. He called Nathan that evening. Nathan picked up on the third ring and sounded, as he always sounded, full of energy and uncomplicated goodwill. They talked for 20 minutes. Oliver almost said something real, almost turned the conversation toward the thing he was actually feeling, but Nathan had a way of steering conversations toward the comfortable and the forward-moving, and Oliver let himself be steered. They made vague plans for a drinks evening that they both knew might or might not happen. Oliver hung up feeling more alone than before he had called. He was not sleeping well. This was new for him. He had always been someone who could sleep the moment his head was on the pillow, and the loss of that easy unconsciousness was disorienting. He lay awake and the thoughts came, not in an organized way but in fragments, scenes and moments, things Serena had said and things he had not fully listened to at the time, things she had done that he had accepted without gratitude, things she had wanted that he had reduced to something smaller because her scale had made him uncomfortable in a way he had never examined. He thought about the consultancy she had mentioned at the dinner table. The thing he had laughed about. He looked it up. It was not difficult to find. She had a website now, clean and professional, and a brief description of her services that made it clear she was offering exactly what she had always been exceptional at: understanding people, understanding communication, building things that lasted. There were 2 testimonials on the page already, from clients she had taken on in the first weeks, and both testimonials said things about her that were precise and warm and entirely recognizable to him. They described someone insightful, patient, exceptionally capable. They described, in the language of professional praise, the person he had lived with for 4 years and consistently minimized. He closed the browser. He was not sure what he had expected to find. He was not sure what he would have done if the consultancy had not existed, if she had been struggling, if he had been able to tell himself that she needed him. She did not need him. She was building something. She was becoming, in the clean air of a life that was now entirely her own, the full-sized version of herself that he had always required her to keep small. He did not feel good about this. That was the thing he would not have predicted. He had not expected to be genuinely sorry. He had expected, perhaps, to feel hard done by, to build a narrative in which he was the one who had been wronged, the one abandoned without fair reason. But the evidence did not cooperate with that narrative, and Oliver had, somewhere beneath the confidence and the volume, enough honesty to recognize when the evidence did not cooperate. He had underestimated her. He had done it casually, consistently, as though it required no effort, as though it were simply the natural order of things. He had laughed at her in front of 8 people, and he had not even noticed the cruelty of it in the moment, which was perhaps the worst part, because cruelty you notice and dismiss is one thing, but cruelty so habitual it has become invisible is something harder to defend against. The business deal with Greg Holt had gone nowhere. He knew this now. He had lost Daniel, and replacing him was proving more difficult than anticipated. 3 of his regular clients had renewed their contracts, but 2 had quietly moved to other firms, and when he asked, through careful and indirect channels, what the reason was, the answers were vague in a way that was not encouraging. He could not trace the exact cause. There was no single meeting that had gone badly, no obvious misstep. There was simply, in his professional life, a gradual cooling, a withdrawal of the particular warmth that makes people choose you when they have other options. He could not see what had caused it. He could not see that Serena had been the warmth, that she had been the quality in his life that made people feel seen and valued and remembered, and that without her presence, the impression he made on the world was increasingly just Oliver, which was impressive on the surface and substantially less sustaining underneath. His mother called on a Sunday. She was a practical and affectionate woman named Carol, and she had always liked Serena with a straightforwardness that Oliver had found slightly annoying in the years when he had not yet understood why. Carol asked how he was. He said fine. She said she had heard he and Serena were no longer together. He confirmed this. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, gently, that she was sorry to hear it, and that she hoped he was looking after himself properly. He said he was. She said she had always admired the way Serena looked after him. She said it without accusation, as a simple observation, and Oliver heard it the way a person hears the thing they have been trying not to think. He said he was fine, again. Carol told him to eat properly and to sleep. He said he would. He hung up and sat with his hands on his knees in the quiet flat, and the quiet was very loud. The evenings were the longest part. He had not understood, before, how much noise another person generates simply by existing in a space, the sounds of movement and presence, the knowledge that there is someone else in the building with you, and how entirely a room changes when that presence is removed. He had always thought of himself as someone who valued his own company. He discovered now that what he had valued, without knowing it, was the freedom to choose solitude within the safety of not actually being alone. Genuine solitude was different. It had a weight to it. He did not call Serena again. He had sent 2 messages, and she had not replied to either, and he understood, with a clarity that was painful precisely because it was clear, that she had nothing more to say to him. Not out of anger. Anger would have left a door open, the possibility of a confrontation, a reckoning, something that could still be engaged with. What she had given him was silence, and the silence said, "This is over," and it was over before it ended, and the only thing left now is for you to understand it. He understood it, in the slow and incomplete way that people understand the things they spent years refusing to see. She did not know what was happening to him. She had chosen, with great deliberateness, not to monitor his life, not to measure her freedom against his unraveling. She had other things to think about. The notebook had started 3.5 years before the dinner party. Serena had kept it in the drawer beside her bed, below a library book and above the small box of items that simply accumulated there over time, a receipts collection, a pen that still worked, a photograph from a holiday in Portugal that she had always meant to frame. She had started the notebook without entirely meaning to, on a Tuesday night when Oliver was out for drinks with Nathan and she was sitting in bed with tea, and the thought arrived, not for the first time but more clearly than before, there is something I should be doing that I am not doing. She had written it down. Then she had kept writing. Over the months that followed, the notebook filled slowly. Notes about her skills and what she was genuinely good at, which turned out to be a long list when she actually wrote it down rather than summarizing it in the diminishing language she had learned to use about herself. Research about the consulting landscape, about what clients in the communications space actually needed and were not getting, about the gap she kept noticing in her professional world between organizations that wanted to connect with people and the people who could actually show them how. Names of contacts. Rough financial projections, cautious ones, revised upward over time as the research suggested she was being more modest than the evidence required. A timeline that had started as aspirational and become, in the final months, genuinely possible. She had not talked about it much. Oliver knew it existed in a vague sense, in the sense that she had mentioned it, once or twice, in the way you mention something when you are testing whether it is safe to mention it. His response had been the tone that made ambition sound like a characteristic to be managed rather than a quality to be encouraged, and she had kept the notebook in the drawer and kept working on it quietly and kept telling herself there would be a better moment. The better moment turned out to be the dinner party. Not because the dinner party had given her anything, not a plan or a permission or a push, but because it had removed something. It had removed the last remaining uncertainty about whether she was seeing things clearly. She had wondered, for a long time, whether she was being unfair, whether the smallness she felt in her life with Oliver was partly her own construction, whether she was, as he had suggested more than once, too sensitive, too easily hurt, too quick to read difficulty where none was intended. The dinner party had answered that question. He had laughed at her, in public, in front of people, and then turned the conversation to something else, and the casual completeness of it had been, in its way, a gift, because it had made everything simple. She had taken the notebook when she moved her things. She had taken it first, before the clothes, before the files, before the small things from the kitchen that were hers. It went into her bag on the first afternoon, and from that point forward it was the one constant object in a life that was rapidly and voluntarily reorganizing itself. Claire had been the first person she called. Then she had called her colleague Marcus Webb, who ran a small creative agency and had told her twice in the past year that he knew 3 people who would hire her immediately if she ever went independent. She called Marcus not to take him up on it, not exactly, but to have a real conversation with a professional she trusted about what she was thinking. Marcus listened, and then he said, "I have been waiting for this conversation," and then he said, "Can we meet Thursday?" and she said yes. By the end of that Thursday meeting, she had 2 referrals and a proposed collaboration and a clarity about her offer that she had been struggling to articulate alone. Marcus was generous with his network in the way that people who are genuinely confident in their own success tend to be, because they know that sharing does not diminish. He introduced her, that same week, to a woman named Priya Harlow, who ran a healthcare communications organization and was looking for exactly the kind of strategic support that Serena's consultancy was built to provide. Serena met Priya the following Monday. The meeting was supposed to be 45 minutes. It ran for 2 hours. By the end of it, Priya had offered a 3-month contract, with the clear intention of making it longer term if, as she clearly expected, the work proved what she suspected it would. Serena accepted the contract and walked out of that office into the afternoon sunlight and stood on the pavement for a moment in the particular way you stand when something real has just happened and you need a second to let it settle. She texted Claire. Claire sent back 6 words, "Told you, didn't I, get in." Serena laughed out loud there on the pavement, in a way that startled a passing cyclist, and then walked to the nearest coffee shop and sat down and opened the notebook and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page and below it wrote, "It started today." The work was hard, the right kind of hard, the kind that stretches you toward your actual capacity rather than away from it. She was working long hours, but they were her hours, shaped by her priorities, aimed at outcomes she had chosen. She was tired in the evenings in the satisfying way, the way that comes from having used yourself fully and well, not the hollow way she had sometimes felt at the end of days spent managing Oliver's life while her own waited quietly in a drawer. She moved into her own flat at the beginning of the second month. She had been at Claire's, in the spare room, and Claire had been wonderful, patient and funny and full of the practical warmth that had always made her the kind of friend worth keeping. But Serena was ready for her own space, the particular freedom of a space that was entirely shaped by her preferences, where every object was there because she had chosen it and every evening was spent as she wanted to spend it. The flat was small and bright and had a kitchen with excellent natural light, and the first evening she spent in it, she cooked herself a real meal for the first time in months, not something elaborate, just pasta with a sauce she had always loved, the recipe her mother had taught her when she was 12, and she ate it at her own table and listened to the music she liked at the volume she liked and felt, in a way she had not felt in a very long time, entirely herself. Diane came to see the flat when it was settled. They had been meeting regularly, their friendship growing with the ease of things that should have happened sooner but are no less good for having taken time. Diane sat on the sofa with a glass of wine and looked around and said, "This looks like you," and Serena had understood exactly what she meant. Not that her previous life had looked like someone else, but that this life had the unmistakable quality of a person who had been allowed to fully occupy it. Priya introduced Serena to 3 other potential clients over the course of the second month. 2 became contracts. The third was not the right fit, and Serena said so clearly and without apology, because she had decided, from the beginning, that she would not build a business the way she had tried to build a relationship, by making herself smaller to accommodate someone else's requirements. Her professional reputation, which she had carefully and consistently earned over a decade of good work, was doing what good reputations do when they are given room. It was spreading. People mentioned her name in the right rooms. People forwarded her details with notes that said, "You have to meet this person," or, "She is exactly who you are looking for." She was not doing anything to engineer this, or rather, she was doing everything, but the everything was simply the work itself, done well and with full attention, which had always been her way and was now, for the first time, being done purely in service of something she had built. Claire asked her, one evening over dinner, whether she was happy. It was the kind of question that requires a moment to answer honestly. Serena thought about it. She said, "I am more myself than I have been in years. I think that might be what happy actually is, when it's the real kind." She did not think about Oliver often. When she did, it was without the particular ache she had expected, the one that usually accompanies the end of a long relationship. She thought about him the way you think about a period in your life that has passed, with a kind of measured recognition, neither affectionate nor bitter, simply clear. She had loved him. She had given a great deal of herself to that love. She did not regret the love, but she had stopped being willing to pay the cost of maintaining it, and leaving had been, in the end, not a loss but a restoration. The third message from Oliver came in the 6th week. It was different from the first 2, quieter in tone, with less of the surface confidence that had always characterized his communication. He said he had been doing a lot of thinking. He said he knew he had not always been fair to her. He said he understood if she did not want to talk, but that he wanted her to know he was sorry, and that he meant it. She read it carefully. She read it twice. She believed that he meant it, or a version of it, as much as a person can mean something they have only just begun to understand. She thought about what she would want from a conversation with him. She tried to imagine what it would accomplish, for either of them, and she could not construct a version of it that ended anywhere other than where they already were. She put the phone in her bag and went back to the proposal she was drafting for a new client, a regional arts organization that was trying to reach younger audiences, and the work pulled her in completely, the way good work does, and by the time she surfaced from it an hour later she had forgotten, genuinely and without effort, that she had ever read the message. She was not performing her recovery. That was the thing people who knew her noticed, the people like Claire and Diane and Marcus and Priya, who had seen her at various points in her life and were watching something new and real occur. She was not working hard at being fine. She was simply fine. She was, in fact, more than fine. She was becoming, in increments that were visible to everyone around her, the full, unhidden version of herself that had been waiting quietly in a notebook drawer for 3.5 years. Oliver Grant had dismissed that version of her at a dinner table. He had called it sweet. He had turned away from it with a laugh and continued his own story. She had taken the rejection and the clarity it delivered, and she had walked away, and she had not looked back, and she had made something real out of the space his dismissal had opened. That, it turned out, was the most honest answer to being underestimated. Not a scene, not a confrontation, not a public reckoning. Just this, becoming entirely, visibly, and unstoppably yourself, in the clean air of a life that belongs to no one else. It took Oliver 6 months to fully understand what had happened. Not 6 months to notice. He noticed almost immediately, in the small practical collapses and the social withdrawals and the professional cooling that followed Serena's departure with an indifference to his feelings that the universe tends to maintain. But noticing and understanding are different things, and understanding arrived later, and it arrived, as real understanding often does, not in a single moment but in a slow accumulation of moments, each one adding a little more weight to the picture until the picture was undeniable. He had lunch with Paul Reese in the 5th month. Paul had been promoted again, and he was in the expansive, generous mood that success sometimes produces, and he was willing to be honest with Oliver in the way that people are willing to be honest when they feel secure enough not to need to protect anyone's feelings. They had been talking about Oliver's business for 20 minutes when Paul said, quietly and without cruelty, "You know, when Serena was around, you always seemed more settled." I don't know how to put it exactly. More looked after. And I think people could feel that, even when they couldn't name it. Oliver did not say anything for a moment. Paul moved the conversation forward, because Paul was not unkind and because he had said what he intended to say and did not want to make it into more than it was. But Oliver stayed with the words, and they went somewhere real. More looked after. He turned the phrase over. He thought about the dinner parties and the carefully arranged evenings and the professional relationships that had been tended with such consistency and skill that he had mistaken them for being natural, for being simply how things were, for being the result of who he was rather than what she had done. He thought about the note. He had found it, actually, months before, tucked into the back of a drawer he rarely opened, in the kitchen. It was a small piece of paper in Serena's handwriting, and it was a list. A shopping list, an ordinary thing, not intended for anyone but herself, written the week before she left. Olive oil, the good kind. Parsley. A card for Nathan's birthday. The wine Oliver likes for the Holt dinner. Check with Grace about the Christmas event. He had stood in the kitchen holding that small piece of paper and looking at it for a long time. It was not a dramatic thing. It was just a list. But it was a list written entirely in service of other people's comfort and other people's occasions and other people's preferences, and his name appeared in it as the recipient of consideration, not its source, and there was something about that small and ordinary piece of paper that said more clearly than anything else could have said what the shape of their life together had actually been. He kept it. He was not sure why. He put it back in the drawer and he left it there. And sometimes when he opened the drawer for something else he saw it and thought about it, and the thinking was not comfortable but it was honest, which was more than he had usually been willing to manage. The professional picture stabilized, eventually, though not at the level it had been at its best. He lost 2 more clients over the winter, both of them situations where the relationship had been primarily warm rather than contractual, the kind of client who chooses a person as much as a service, and who had been choosing, all along, a warmth that was no longer in the room. He adapted. He was good at his work in the transactional sense, competent and reliable on the fundamentals, and that was enough to keep the business alive, though it had a different quality now, more functional and less flourishing. He hired a project manager to replace Daniel. The new person was competent but not Daniel, and the office had a slightly different atmosphere, more professional and less warm, which was sometimes described as more efficient. Oliver had learned to live with efficient. It was not what he had had before. He had not known, before, that what he had had before was rare. Nathan and he remained friends, though the friendship existed at a different frequency than it once had. They still went for drinks. They still talked about work and sport and the things that men like Oliver and Nathan talk about when they are talking but not quite reaching the real things. Once, after 3 drinks, Nathan said something sideways about Diane having become close with Serena, and Oliver said, "I know," and they left it at that, because there was nothing that could usefully be added. He started going to the gym more regularly. He took on a project in a different city that required him to spend several weeks there, and the distance was useful in the way that distance is sometimes useful, giving him room to exist in a context where no one knew the before and after of him. He was simply Oliver Grant, property developer, competent and confident and unaccompanied, and in that new context he was able to begin building a slightly more honest version of himself, one that did not depend on the invisible support of someone he had been too careless to value. He did not call himself changed. He was suspicious of that word, the way he was now suspicious of several things he had once accepted without question. But he was different in some ways, quieter in some ways, more attentive in certain moments that had previously passed through him without leaving a trace. He listened more carefully at meetings. He thanked people more specifically, noting the thing they had done rather than offering a general gratitude. He called his mother more often. Carol noticed and said nothing and was clearly pleased. He met a woman in the new city, toward the end of his time there. Her name was Lucy, and she was independent and unhurried and did not arrange herself around him, which he found, to his own surprise, refreshing rather than unsettling. He did not pursue it beyond a few good evenings, it was not the right time for that. But the good evenings told him something, confirmed something he was working toward, the capacity to be in the presence of a person who was fully themselves without feeling diminished by it, without needing to be the tallest thing in the room. Serena's website continued to develop. He checked it occasionally, in the way that people check things they tell themselves they have moved on from, and each time there was something new, a case study added, a testimonial, a press mention from a communications industry publication that described her firm as one to watch among a new wave of independent practices. He read these things with a complex emotion that he had gotten better at tolerating, something that contained pride and loss and regret in approximately equal measure, and that he had stopped trying to simplify into any one of those things alone. He was, finally, beginning to see her clearly. That was what he had not been able to do before, what the dinner party and the laughter and the casual dismissal had confirmed. He had not been able to see her clearly, because seeing her clearly would have required him to make room for the fullness of who she was, and making room would have meant accepting that she was not simply the warm, capable, ever-available woman who kept his life running. She was a person with her own scale and her own ambitions and her own understanding of the world, a person whose capacities were in several respects greater than his own, and that had not been comfortable for him to sit with, so he had not sat with it. He understood now what he had done. He had taken a remarkable person and made her feel small, not through any single dramatic cruelty but through the accumulated weight of daily carelessness, the kind of carelessness that is easy to maintain because it never quite crosses into the territory that demands to be called wrong. He had laughed at her. He had spoken over her. He had received her work and her warmth and her intelligence as though they were simply features of the environment, weather, light, the baseline of life, rather than choices she was making every day, gifts she was giving that she did not have to give. She had not made a scene. She had not given him the confrontation that might have let him redirect blame or construct a narrative in which he was misunderstood. She had simply left, with her quiet and her dignity intact, and the absence of drama had been, in its own way, the most honest verdict on the relationship, because it said, "There is nothing here worth fighting about any longer. I am done." The kingdom, as he would have once called it, had not crumbled entirely. That was too neat a story, and life is rarely that neat. But it had settled into something smaller and more ordinary than it had been, something that ran on his effort alone rather than on the combined and largely unacknowledged effort of two people. The shine was different. The warmth was different. The ease with which people moved toward him was different, less certain, more considered. He was rebuilding. It was slower and more honest than building had been the first time. He had fewer illusions about what he was doing and fewer shortcuts available, and the result was something that felt, occasionally, like real progress rather than the impression of it. And Serena was building too, faster and with greater joy and in a direction that had no ceiling she could yet see, and the people who knew them both, who could observe the parallel lines of these two lives now moving separately through the world, were not surprised by the difference. They had never been surprised. The woman who had kept the machine running had turned out to be the engine after all. And an engine, once it understands what it actually is, does not go back to being a background function in someone else's story. She had walked away on a quiet night, without drama or noise, and the kingdom had begun to show its cracks, and she had not looked back, not even once, because there was nothing behind her that she had not already outgrown. Some people only understand the value of what they held when the silence becomes permanent. And by then, as people who knew Serena Lawson well could have told anyone who asked, she had already become something they had no category for, entirely, brilliantly, and permanently unreachable. That is how the story ends. Not in a confrontation or a ceremony, not in a triumph that looks like revenge, but in the simple and absolute fact of a woman who knew her own worth, eventually, and stopped giving it to someone who did not. And that, in the end, was more than enough.